So you're going to get kind of what Glenn students got, just a little more expanded. And we're going to talk about Patrick County and the home front.
Thank you.
Before I do that, if I can figure, you know, Darryl, they got a pointer that has a laser pointer on this thing. We'll train you next time. Who I am is Tom Perry from Arad. My dad was a principal here in Patrick County for 30 years. There he is with my mother. We started a scholarship several years ago in his name. We'll give it away every year to a Patrick County graduating senior. I make them write a 1,000-word history essay, and the one I like the best gets the money. So we've been doing that, and we've given 7 away in honor of my parents. Here are some of the lovely young ladies. It's been 6 females and only 1 guy. How do you put these pictures? Did you have my dad in school? Did you ever have my dad in school, Mary?
Yes.
Yes, you had him in school.
I had him as a teacher, and also he coached our basketball team.
So my father was quite extroverted, gregarious kind of fellow. He had the best line I ever heard any man. His name was Erie, E-R-I-E, Erie Perry of down area. And he would tell the women he was irresistible. We're doing some things. I'm going to tell you a couple things we're doing. This is Saturday. If you recognize Danny Martin,
Yep.
I published a book for Danny about moonshine. Danny was my 9th grade algebra teacher at Patrick County High School. And he looks the same. I think he's 75 and he looks the same. So we're doing that Saturday in Arad. If you're interested, it's a fundraiser for my scholarship. So if you want to come, we'll no free samples.
Where?
At the Raritan Club. At the Raritan Club. I'm sorry, I didn't let you read that long enough. At the Raritan Club, we do these 3 or 4 times a year to raise money for my scholarship, and it's been very successful. We've talked about all Bob Childers, the Dinky Railroad, and moonshine on Saturday.
He's actually doing that here on.
And he's doing that October 7th, yes. Yeah, so Danny, he also does great walking tours out there at Parish Stone if you ever go. But he was my algebra teacher. That same day in Arad, we built a piece of the old Dinky Railroad, and we'll do that in the afternoon. If you're interested in old railroad history, that'll be at the Jeb Stewart birthplace. And we've, how much, 10 feet, 20 feet, Mary? I think it's been, they got a pretty good piece of it.
Approximately 20 feet.
20 feet of it, we've rebuilt it. So it went from Kibler Valley to Mount Airy. They hauled all the timber out of Kibler Valley. And they took it to the furniture factories, things like that in Mount Airy. And maybe I can figure out how to operate this thing there. Mary, I'd be in trouble if I didn't tell you the Jeb Stewart reenactment is October 7th, and it's 7th and 8th, and there's the schedule. If you're interested in seeing lots of Confederates kill Yankees, you can come on out there. I know my Georgia War mother was in that part.
Can we participate?
We have great music lined up.
Great music, but no live ammunition.
3 times Saturday and 2 times Sunday.
Yeah, but we do that 30 years now. Patrick County, you may not realize, is on all these Civil War trails. We have Virginia, the Civil War Discovery Trail, and of course we were big in the 150th, mostly at the birthplace. So if you're interested in that, there's web pages for some of those things. The birthplace, like I said, is on all of them, so you can find out about the Jeb Stewart birthplace. I'm going to talk a lot about books in my presentation, and the Right Honorable Darryl Holland, of course, has a book about the war. All of Virginia, I believe just about all the Virginia regiments have regimental histories before our good friend died. Didn't publish those. But this is Darryl's book on the 24th, but you can get a regimental history of just about every Virginia unit. And they're gray like this. I guess some of them are kind of hard to find these days. I looked yours up last night, and somebody wanted like $100 for one of yours. So
That's a good buy.
you can reprint that thing, Darryl. And what I'm going to be talking about is from my book, which is about Patrick County in the war. But I talk a lot about books when I do these things, because, well, that's, if you're a Civil War buff, that's how you get it. And I believe I'm right about this. the Civil War, other than the Bible and maybe Jesus, has had more books written about it than probably anything ever published, so it's incredible. I'm here because in the spring of 1982, I walked into McBride Hall 100 and ran into this fellow, James I. Robertson Jr., who was the Civil War professor at Virginia Tech. And teachers can change your life. He changed mine. Bud's not with us anymore, but I'll let his words go. You don't understand this country if you don't understand this war. The picture on the right is funny. He came to raise money for the Bassett Historical Center. And if you knew Bud was not a very tall fellow, and I am. And Bud got in a chair, and he had just whispered it into my ear right there. I always wanted to be as tall as you SOB. All my papers about Jeb Stewart are also at Tech because of Bud. And of course, if you know Bud, you know that you spent a lot of time with Stonewall Jackson. And that was Bud's thing, and from his, I guess his master's and doctoral thesis up to the big book he wrote about Jackson. That was his thing. When I had him, we were talking about this a minute ago, when I had him as a teacher, he was an ACC field judge, football. And one day I got to see my professor get cussed out on national TV by Clemson's head coach, Danny Ford. Bud didn't think that was near as funny as we did. So, it's still with us. Darrell was talking about earlier, states' rights, civil rights. The first Santa Claus comes along during the war. First time we really have women teachers is because of the war. First time we have left and right shoes because of the war. All these things happen as a result of the war. This is some of Bud's favorite stuff right here, so I always put it in there. But, and if you don't think it's still with us, yeah, Patrick County. Of course, a couple of years ago, the great controversy about the portrait of Jeb, and of course the statue there in the courthouse lawn. And when I used to tell the 11th graders all this stuff, it is not Jeb Stewart. It is not a statue of Jeb Stewart. That is a Confederate infantryman on the top. We're going to talk about a lot of them over the next 6 weeks. Jeb's on the plaque there at the base. But you know, how many times do you ever hear people say that's the Jeb Stewart statue? It's not Jeb Stewart. It's not. Now, I don't much get into Moonlight and Magnolia. I guess I'm more of a Cold Mountain man. But you know, most people are interested in the war because of Gone with the Wind and all that. Vivian Lee is still a fetching woman, I will tell you that. But I don't talk much about all that sort of thing. Because this is war, and war is not pretty. And you're about to find out how Patrick County went through this war, and a lot of it isn't pretty. I'm just going to tell you up front. And I think that's the way you should approach it. Although Clark Gable pretty fetching too, isn't he? I'm just looking at Clark there. So we'll begin where Darrell was. 1859, John Brown raids Harper's Ferry, as Darrell was talking about earlier, to get the weapons because he wants to have a slave revolt. Jeb Stewart goes with Robert E. Lee and the Marines, and they go up there, and Jeb Stewart is sent to the door. The firehouse used to be up pretty close to where the railroad comes across that bridge right there. They moved it down into the flat, I think, so it's easier to get to. But there's a little marker up there to show you where the original firehouse was. It was much closer up to town, right on the river right there as the trains meeting. That's where I think it was. But Jeb Stewart goes and he recognizes John Brown. Darrell, we're using the same pictures. Look at this. That's the only known picture I know of of Jeb Stewart as a United States cavalry officer. He grew the beard when he joined the U.S. Army. It was said of him that he was the only man a beard improved. His classmates at West Point thought he was so ugly they called him Beauty. They didn't mean that in a nice way. They did not mean that in a nice way. But he had encountered John Brown multiple times in Kansas. I think the first time was probably 1856 at a place called Blackjack, Kansas. And Stewart recognized Brown when he, of course, opens the door and puts that gun right in Jeb Stewart's face. And you go back and study this a little bit. Some funny stuff about this. Stewart's one of the ones that went in and talked to him after this. And John Stewart about how he could have blown him away if he had just wanted to and all this stuff. And Stewart is after John Brown about how can you be a Christian and do all this and da 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 da. And back and forth they go. It's in a newspaper interview. And it's pretty interesting to see John Brown and Jeb Stewart going at each other after all of this. But what this does, in my opinion, is this changes Jeb Stewart's view of the world too. He saw it up close and personal what could happen if John Brown had been successful at this. Stewart before this, you know, he grew up in Ararat. He'd gone to West Point. He had made a career as a military man because, you know, he's the youngest son. He's not going to inherit a lot. So, you know, the Army is his life. He gets married. And when he sees this, his tone changes. If you read his letters, it completely changes. He goes from being all in to writing the governor of Virginia, telling the governor of Virginia that he needs to be getting ready because the war is coming. And Stewart hints pretty strongly that he's ready to go with Virginia. Now, he's still in the United States Army, writing the governor of Virginia, telling him to get ready, the war's coming. So I think John Brown really changed Jeb Stewart's view of a lot of this. So in 1860, here's our county. 9,000 people, 2,000 are black, and we actually have about 133 people of color living in this county who are not slaves. We have voters, 3,500 white men. Half of them are going to be Confederate soldiers. And I used to, at the high school, I'd get 4 guys.
Is that the total, including blacks? 9,000?
Yeah, I think so. I think 9,000 is the total population. And so it means there's 7,000 white and 2,000 black. So if you're one of those Confederate soldiers, one of you's going to die, one of you's going to be wounded. I think the third one of you is probably going to come back mentally, probably pretty messed up on this, and one of you will come back as a fairly normal human being. But just to show you, half the white men in Patrick County were soldiers. And I think that's pretty standard probably for most Virginia counties. We'll repeat a little bit of what Darrell was talking about. Jeb Stewart voted for John Bell, believe it or not. How do I know that? Jeb Stewart wrote letters. And he was a John Bell man. Bell was a moderate, kind of in the middle guy, or the ostrich sticking his head in the sand, I guess. John Breckinridge is going to end up being a general in the Confederate Army. He had been vice president of the United States. I went to his grave in Kentucky about a month ago. He's buried up there. And I was going to a Mayberry festival. I have a look at Andy Griffith, and I go to Mayberry festivals, which is a little different world than what we're talking about right here. I'll tell you that. But this is Mayberry Days. If you come to Mount Airy this week, it is Mayberry Days. But like I said, John Bell is going to, I think, win Patrick County and Virginia, and Jeb Stewart voted for it. But imagine how our elections are today. I can't imagine 4 of them running at the same time. Imagine what would Fox News and MSNBC do with 4 of them. Good gosh. Jeb Stewart, for one, is sitting out in Kansas watching to see what happens. Virginia does not leave the Union until Fort Sumter. And Jeb Stewart is watching to see, because he's not resigning his commission until he sees what Virginia's going to do. And here's how it worked out. The people actually got to vote on this, as Darrell showed you. Here's how Patrick County voted, almost 700 to 164 before they had been against it. But the Fort Sumter and Lincoln's call for troops really changes people's opinion about a lot of this. Patrick County in the war, our men are going to fight in every place you could imagine in this war. They start off fighting, I think, up in West Virginia. Here is Abe and Jeff. You were talking about Alexander Stevens earlier. If you ever see the movie Lincoln, Alexander Stevens is in that movie. He's one of the guys who comes to negotiate with Lincoln at the end of the war. And Alexander Stevens wrote, I love to talk about books, wrote absolutely, I think, the worst book I have ever read about the Civil War. That thing is an insomnia killer. If that book don't put you to sleep, nothing will put you to sleep. Stevens, I had a cousin who lived in his town in Georgia he lived in. This is State Park, his house. But I'm going to tell you, Alexander, he was not, he wasn't Abraham Lincoln when he came to the pros. Let me tell you, he was not. This is several years old now. I always like to do this. You were talking about North Carolina claiming they have the most troops. Well, they went back and redid all of the Confederate war records several years ago. And this is from Bob Crick, who was the head historian of Fredericksburg, probably the greatest Civil War historian I ever knew, Bob Crick. He's still alive. But Virginia sent 200,000, more than North Carolina. We like to brag about, if you're from Virginia, that North Carolina thing. And that's not just in basketball, that's in everything. Patrick County, like I said, sent 1,700 men to fight the war, and those are the other states. They now estimate that something over 700,000 Americans died in this war. For years, they thought it was around 600. Now they estimate that it's over 700,000 lost their lives. And we'll just go through this. This is the 51st Virginia. Patrick County had 2 regiments, 2 companies in this regiment. And this is how it breaks down from Jeff Davis down to Rufus Woolwine and William Dennis Vie. You saw the very first slide, William Dennis Vie. It was a dentist from Stewart, and he and Woolwine were both in the 51st Virginia. In 2 weeks, I'll talk a lot about these guys. But this is just how the 51st broke down. And this is in 1865, and the order that everybody was in. Gabriel Wharton there, who was the brigade commander. Jack Davis just has published a great book about, I think it's the letters between Wharton and his wife during the war. So great book. The Patrick County guys had one time a guy named August Forsberg, and he was from Sweden. Now I'm trying to imagine a guy from Sweden trying to talk to some of the guys I grew up with from Patrick County. Talk about a communication breakdown. My gosh, I can't imagine what that would have been like. Rufus Woolwine, who is going to end up, probably, if it wasn't for Jeb Stewart, Rufus might be the most famous soldier from this county. The reason Rufus is going to be famous is Rufus kept a diary, and it's been published. And you can read about what life was like for him during the war. And one of the things he did was he came back to Patrick County a lot, and how do I put this gently? He was on recruiting duty, which means he was not necessarily just recruiting the guys, he was forcibly enlisting them. So there's all kinds of stories about he going to Rock Castle Gorge, and he was trying to get these 2 boys, Belcher boys, I believe, and the way he got them to come out was he took their daddy and hung him on a tree, and got the boys to try to come out so that he could put them in the army. Otherwise, Daddy was going to hang there until he died. Mike Ryan up at the National Park Service on the Parkway has written a great book about Rock Castle Gorge and tells some of these stories. Here's Rufus. His dad, like you see there, was I think the first postmaster, and I think that's why it's Woolwine, because it was named after him. And this is Rufus as a young man. He's looking very dapper there. But he's going to survive this, and like I said, he wrote a great diary about the war. I encourage you to go and read. It's very well done. The Virginia Historical Society published it, oh goodness, going back in the 60s. And here's some of the places the 51st Virginia is going to fight. A lot in West Virginia. They end up with our good friend Jubal Early in Waynesboro in March of 65, and that's pretty much the end of the regiment because they're all captured or escaped, encountering Mr. George Custer. And again, the regimental history about them. All these guys, the regiments are all published, and you can read about them in great detail, some of them not so much, but there's rosters in these books. As Darrell Holland, I'm sure, knows all about doing that. we'll talk a little bit about flags. This is their flag. Now, this isn't your typical Confederate battle flag, is it? This is the Virginia flag. Six Semper Tyrannis. As my buddy Mike Hayes used to say, get your foot off my neck.
I think it's a woman in the square.
There's 2,000 African Americans living in this county during the war. Most of them are slaves. If you are a free person of color in this county, you have to go to the courthouse and you have to register. It costs 25 cents then. You got a piece of paper that says you were a free person. If you don't have that piece of paper, or for whatever reason, they can enslave you. So there's only about 130, 40 people in Patrick County who that fit. There's, like I said, 60,000 in the whole state of Virginia and 500 in the United States, below, I think, the Mason-Dixon line. And the other thing the county did is half the men now have gone to war. So you've got, give or take, 1,700 white men, you've got 2,000 slaves in this county. They started doing what I call the slave patrols. Every magisterial district, I think there were 6 then, we would have gentlemen justices who were supervisors today, what we would call supervisors. And they would appoint people, and they would go out at night and ride. And their job is to do a couple of things. One is to be a police force for the county, but their other job is to make sure that there are no slave gatherings and break them up if there are. To make sure that the slaves are where they're supposed to be. If you're out as a slave and you have no reason to be out, they're going to find you. Yes, ma'am.
How would a person prove that they were free?
You'd have to have a piece of paper. You have to go to the courthouse and get it. And they
How
would,
would they believe it?
well, I think they believed you if you could prove you were free. I doubt if any slave went in there and said, I'm a free person. I just don't believe that would work. Patrick County would have been such a closed society, I think they would know. I think they would know. But you wouldn't go in there and just pretend to be free if you weren't. That would get you in all kinds of trouble too, I expect. But they lost my train of thought. The way I know this, how do I know this? Well, we've never had a fire in the courthouse. Patrick County since 1790, give or take, all the records are there. So if you're willing to go in there and dig, you can see all this. I got almost all of what you're seeing in this from the order books. You just go and sit and read the order books. Yes, ma'am.
Were these patrollers officials and paid for their work?
Yes.
Okay, so they were sort of really like a
Yes, it's like our supervisors today would appoint a few fellows from each district, and their job was to go around and ride at night. Now, this kind of sounds like the makings of the Ku Klux Klan, I guess, and in some ways maybe it is. Patrick County is not as hardcore as other places are, but they would literally ride around the county at night, because think about this, half the men are gone to war, and there's as many slaves now as there are free white men. So you see, they're concerned about this. I'm actually amazed that we didn't have slave revolts, that we didn't have a Nat Turner or somebody come up and do that. But I have never seen any records where in this county we had that as a problem. But you had to literally go to the courthouse and get registered, and if you didn't have that piece of paper on you, they could put you back in the slave. I don't know how you would go in there and prove that, except you might have had the paper from the year before or something to show that you were a free person. But we're only talking about 130, 40 people out of 2,000.
Plus, not many slaves would have had 25 cents.
Not many slaves would be walking into the courthouse. That would have took some gumption, I expect. As the war goes into 1862, the Confederates are going to start implementing drafts. It's funny that the Confederate government has a draft before the Union government has a draft. That's kind of interesting. We have the Battle of the Ironclads. The old wives' tale has always been that, before they built Philpott Lake, there was a lot of iron forge activity going on where Ferry Stone Park is, and some of that ended up in the Confederate Virginia. It was the Merrimack, and I don't know if you ever experienced this, but if you ever said to Bud Robertson that it was the Merrimack, it was not pretty for you. It was the CSS Virginia. It was not the Merrimack. And Bud, eviscerate, is that the word I used a while ago? Eviscerate. 51st Virginia guys are going to be at Fort Donelson, where they're going to be encountering Mr. Ulysses S. Grant, and Patrick County soldiers are going to fight in all the major battles in the East. And got to put my glasses on, I can't see anymore. Civil War has blinded me. Just to show you, the Commonwealth Attorney, we were talking about Staples, the Commonwealth Attorney in Patrick County was John Shelton. He made $150 a year to be the Commonwealth Attorney. I don't know what Ms. Bobbitt makes as the Commonwealth Attorney, but I have a sneaky suspicion it's a little bit more than that. I bring her up because I saw her, I was pumping gas beside her out at the Circle K before I came in today. There she was. But Clerk of Court Henry Tubble, he made $75 a year to be the Clerk of Court. We got 3 ladies running for Clerk of Court right now. I have a feeling it's a little bit more than that for them too. 1861 and 62, I'll tell you some of the things that happened. We had 343 people born in Patrick County, and we lost 207 people at the beginning of the war. We had supervisors who were very concerned about the outcome and the well-being of our soldiers. Because, you know, a man is off fighting in the war, his wife, his children, or sometimes probably at the level of starvation. The county started spending money on things like salt. They spent $13,000 in 1 year just to go get salt, because you use salt to preserve meat, fish, all sorts of things. They bought the salt, believe it or not, from Jeb Stewart's brother, William Alexander Stewart, who ran the salt works in Salt. And that's where they got it. Just to show you, they're very, very concerned. And you see what inflation does to this county in the course of the war. 1 year, we had 145 children die of diphtheria alone during this war. 145 children of one disease. I showed the courthouse there because the courthouse, like I said, all these records are there. You just got to be willing to go dig and read through all the old books, things like that. What you'll start to have as the war progresses, of course, is deserters and people taking advantage, criminals, especially in the mountain areas. You're going to have lots of places you can hide, and as the war progresses, that's going to get worse and worse as well. So while you think about the wars, you know, what General Lee's doing up in Fredericksburg and stuff, back here in Patrick County, it's survival mode. It really becomes survival mode pretty quick in this. During the war, Patrick County made its own money, printed its own money.
Know that.
This is a $1 Patrick County note. If you'll notice, it's printed on another bank note. They had the paper was kind of short, so they started, I think they got the paper out of Greensboro, and it was another bank that had defaulted and they started printing money. And these Patrick County notes are kind of cool because they're colored, green and red. I had a good friend of mine, Gerald Bye. Gerald's passed away now. Gerald, and I think, what was the fellow at the Moody funeral home? Maines? Was it Ed Maines? James Maines?
Ed Mays.
Ed Mays and Gerald Bye had almost every one of the Patrick County notes between the two of them. They collected them over the years, and they had all the Confederate money printed in Patrick County. I don't know what's happened to Ed's, but Gerald passed away, and I think his family still has his. But they did this over the course of the whole war. Every year they would print more money. And you imagine what that did, inflation is starting to go. We think inflation, you think inflation's bad now. Oh gosh, you ain't saying nothing compared to this. But we literally, Virginia authorized every county to print their own money. And we did. Did you, were you gonna ask me something? Were you gonna ask me something? I thought so. 1863 comes along. Patrick County men are going to be fighting in all of these battles, Gettysburg, Lincoln, of course, issues the Emancipation Proclamation, which really doesn't free anybody because it's for slaves behind the Confederate lines. Jefferson Davis is also getting a little desperate for men. He starts to offer pardons for men who had deserted during the war. Here's another regiment from Patrick County, the 42nd Virginia, and that's Johnny Penn up there in the top. Johnny Penn is famous for, I think he lost an arm or a leg in the war, but he's also the man who starts Virginia Tech after the war. He puts the bill forward to make Virginia Tech the land-grant university for the Commonwealth. And he was from this part of the world. The other picture there is the four Penn brothers, who Joseph Thomas, John, and William, and I believe two of them don't come back from the war, and the other two do. This is their battle flag, which looks like more what you would expect a Confederate battle flag, I think, to look like. The thing, I don't know if this is true to you, Darryl, but with me, there's nothing in the Confederate war effort that is consistent. You might have guys in one regiment who have a flag from Virginia, you might have uniforms, nobody is dressed alike early in the war, especially, and there's no consistency across the board. You know, states' rights, I guess, and all that kind of thing. But they, it would have been incredible to see a Confederate army coming at you, I think, because I don't know that you could tell who was who a lot of times in all this.
Are the Penns that are listed there, are they from the Henry County, the Penns?
They, I think, are what we would call the pink house.
Yeah, that's the,
What we would call the pink house.
The
I think
pink
that's
plantation,
I think
yes.
that's them, yeah. In December '62, the Confederate government starts requesting people to send slaves to help the war effort. And these men aren't going to be soldiers. These men are going to be the guys who dig the ditches, build the trenches, all that kind of thing, do the work that the other men, the white men, don't do because they're fighting. There was a great story I remember about Gettysburg, about a Union officer who got captured, and they took him behind the Confederate lines. And, you know, when he goes through the lines, and the front lines where all the soldiers are, it's all white people, white men. He said he got back in the back, and his words were, it was a sea of black faces. All of the teamsters, all of the cooks, all the people behind the lines in the Confederate Army were black. And this is one of the reasons they literally conscripted people, and you had to donate your slaves to the Confederate war effort.
but they were still slaves.
They were still slaves, they weren't soldiers. Yes, sir?
The question about, you said that 51st was at Fort Donelson.
Yeah.
Well, you know, were they captured?
They surrendered them and paroled
Okay,
them. I think is what happens to them, and they continue to fight.
okay.
It's early in the war. Grant hasn't turned into the Grant he's going to become, where he doesn't want to give up any Confederate soldiers. But there are even 15 free people in Patrick County who end up having to go off. And they end up in places like Pulaski and just all kinds of places. And they're literally doing the grunt work so that the white men can fight. And, you know, there's a lot of talk about black Confederates and stuff. I've never come across a black Confederate soldier from Patrick County. I don't doubt that there were black Confederate soldiers, but I've never come across one from this county. But this is what they did. And you can see 62, 63, and 65, if you were the Reynolds, if you were Hardin Reynolds, they expected you to send some of your black men to help the Confederate war effort. And if you didn't, well, I guess the sheriff might come looking for you or something. But you had to do that, or they would make life difficult for you. So this is something, and how do I know this? I know this because it's in the order books in the Patrick County Courthouse. And it lists the slaves, owners, and how many each one of them sent to fight in the war.
Mr. Perry,
Yes, ma'am.
excuse me, was there a percentage of the number of slaves that an individual possessed?
I think each supervisor, as I recall, each supervisor would tell Hardin Reynolds, you've got to give this many. You know, there was a number the county was supposed to supply, so each supervisory district was supposed to supply this many, and each supervisor within that district would tell, because, you know, they know who owns the most slaves. If you're,
So county by county,
Mhm.
they would look at the slave population there and divide it.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. 'Cause they have census records.
Percentage.
They have census records that show who owns the most slaves and that kind of thing.
Thank you.
But they, your supervisor would pretty much say, you know, Hardin, you need to give 5 or whatever. I think that's how they did it. I think that's how they did it. We have elections in Patrick County in 64, and we get a new Commonwealth attorney and new clerk and same sheriff, I believe, if I remember correctly, on some of this. There's some other things going on, you know, during this war. Here's one story I'll tell you. There was a guy named Henry Penn who was a slave, and I think he was owned by the people who we call the Pink House out there on 58. And he was caught breaking and entering. And apparently he stole something like $1,800 worth of property. And he had a trial, and they hung him. And there was no fooling around. There was no appeal process here. You got caught for doing something, especially if you were a slave, you lost your life. It was pretty much that cut and dry. Another thing they did, they're buying corn, they're buying wheat, they're buying salt, they're trying to buy all kinds of things to help the soldiers' families. And for instance, in one year they bought $4,000 of the corn from Georgia. And the way they paid for it is, I think they took iron from out here at Ferrystone and sent that to Georgia as a barter to get the wheat or the corn back to feed the families. So the supervisors are all, you know, while they're not that concerned about what the war's doing, how Robert E. Lee's doing, and all this kind, they're very concerned about feeding the families of the soldiers in this county. And if you look in the order books, it's just paragraph after paragraph where they talk about nothing else. I don't know, the supervisors' meetings are kind of contentious now. I don't know what they would have been like during the war like that. In 64, just to show you, they spent $10,000 to buy cotton and wool. And again, they would swap some of the iron made out here at Firestone to pay for it. And they would ship that off to different places because people are freezing to death, people are starving to death, while their husbands and sons are all fighting in the war. I told you it wasn't going to be too much moonlight and magnolia today. Here's the 50th Virginia, and this is my favorite picture, Chesley Race. I think that's my favorite picture of any Patrick County soldier I've ever seen. And these guys see some of the hardest fighting in the entire war from Patrick County. You see some of the battles they're in. And I was at the high school one time doing this, and one of the students raised his hands and said, well, that's my great-granddad. That's almost as good as the other story I love to tell about that. You remember when Lisa Martin used to do the programs out here? Well, her daughter, Sydney, I guess, was one of the students. And Sydney sat on the very front row and just grinned at me the whole time I'm talking about the war. And I'm trying to figure out why in the world was this girl grinning at me. I don't know her, you know, she's just smiling at me. So at the end I said, does anybody have any questions? Her hand goes up, you know, and I said, yes. And she says, is it true you were sweet on my mama in high school? And I said, who is your mama? And she told me, and I said, yes. Next question. She had been sitting there the whole time thinking she was going to get me to tell something on her mama, and she didn't know, and I did not do it because fear of Lisa will do that to a man. But that is a true story. She said, "Were you sweet on my mama?"
She probably couldn't wait to ask you that question.
I know, she probably couldn't either. Lisa, I'll tell y'all, I wouldn't tell Cindy, Lisa rejected me for wanting more medals than Dan boys. Maybe I'll write a book about that one day. Now, we did have guys from Patrick County who fought for the other side. Try to control yourself, Darryl. Try to control yourself. A couple of these guys are interesting. Joshua Branch, who fought, I think Joshua was equal opportunity. He fought on both sides during the war. And he's buried in the Pettigo Cemetery, Mary, over there near Judge Stewart's birthplace. It's interesting, he's buried in the back of the cemetery by himself. The stone is out there by himself, and there's nobody anywhere close to him that's marked. And I wonder if that doesn't have something to do
Where
with
did
it.
you say he was buried?
He's buried at the Pettigo Cemetery beside the Judge Stewart birthplace over there. But he is literally out by himself. One of the other guys, Lewis B. Puckett here, some of you might know Shelby and Raleigh. Raleigh's, I think, grandfather, great-grandfather, there were 7 or 8 Puckett brothers. And all of them fought for the Confederacy except for Lewis. Lewis had moved to Ohio, Indiana, and he fought for the Union. Now, I don't know when they had Puckett reunions what happened, but I don't know. I just don't know. But just to show you, it really was a brothers' war. That Lewis had 6 brothers who fought for the Confederacy. But Branch has always kind of tickled me because he's buried over there, and that grave is out. He's out completely by himself, and I've always wondered if that was the reason they knew what he had done. But he liked to apparently enlist with any regiment that was paying hard cash, and he'd stay a while, and then he would move on to his next regiment. Of course, you know, it's not like today. He changed his name. If somebody didn't know him, he'd get away with it. So, as the war starts to end here, a lot of Patrick County soldiers are captured up there in Waynesboro when Custer decimates Jubal Early's, what's left of Jubal Early's command. On April the 9th, George Stoneman and his nearly, 4,000 Yankee cavalry are sitting in the town of Taylorsville, what you would know as Stewart. Most of the letters I see, though, they don't call it Taylorsville, they call it Patrick Courthouse. It would be Stewart in 1884, but during the war, most of the letters that I've read, they call it Patrick Courthouse. George Stoneman is sitting over there with about 3,000 of his Union cavalry on his raid. William J. Palmer is sitting over in Martinsville with 1,000, part of the same command. They'll get back together at Danbury. Robert E. Lee, of course, will surrender on the 9th, and the formal surrender will be on the 12th. And Jefferson Davis will be captured down in Georgia on May the 10th. Now, George Stoneman is kind of an interesting guy. He's the only guy I know who's in a song by the band, The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down. George Stoneman has a couple of lines in that song. Robbie Robertson, the guitar player, died here not too long ago from the band. And this is George, and he left Knoxville and came over to visit us. This is the only time we really have any action of any number during the entire war. And we almost missed it entirely because it's the last week of the war that he comes to Patrick County. George is an interesting dude. He had been the commander of all the Union cavalry, like at the Battle of Chancellorsville, and because he performed badly or got snickered into some things, he lost his job. George ends up out west in Knoxville, and he's trying to redeem his reputation. George had one of the most ridiculous medical conditions for a cavalryman I've ever heard of. George suffered from hemorrhoids. He was a cavalryman. So I'll just try to imagine that for a while. But here he is. You see Stoneman's raid signs, and that's old George himself.
He came through here, too.
He came through here. These are some of his the men who were under him. Brown, Palmer's the one in the middle there who was in Martinsville with 1,000 men or so. I think Mr. Palmer had repeating rifles, and some of the Confederates ran into him, and he outnumbered about 3-1, and he had repeating rifles. Well, that was the end of the Battle of Martinsville. That didn't take too long, as you might imagine. Most of these guys, Palmer is the exception, were Southerners who remained loyal to the Union. And they kind of had an agenda. They were going to make the South pay, and it's a wonder that Reynolds Homestead's still here with these guys, or the town of Stewart is still here, because they had a tendency, especially if they were fired upon, they would burn your town to the ground. Especially if Stoneman and Palmer were not around. They weren't very well behaved. My buddy Chris Hartley has written a great book about Stoneman's raid. It's been out for several years now. If you're interested in that, he goes into great detail. But these are some of the Stoneman's raiders. And Palmer, the guy in the middle there, like I said, he's the one in Martinsville. Palmer's kind of my favorite Yankee, I like to call him. After the war, he's going to go out west. He's going to go to Kansas and Colorado. He's going to build railroads. He had been a Quaker before the war, and he became a multimillionaire after the war. And he built the Durango and Silverton. You can ride that still, I think. And Palmer gave almost all his money away. He built churches and sanatoriums, and I think the Quaker faith that he had really steered him in that direction. But he's quite a fellow. His house is in Colorado Springs. It's called Glen Erie. It's owned by a Christian men's group. And I can only tell you that William Palmer lived in a castle. That's the only thing I can use to describe this thing. He made that much money in his life. But he came through Martinsville, and then he goes back to Danbury, where he connects back up with Stone. Here we go. We'll talk about this in a couple of weeks in a lot more detail, but of course, the story I've always heard is that Hardin Reynolds sends RJ and the livestock up on No Business Mountain. You got no business being up there, and he hides from Stoneman's raiders. One of the things that happens, though, is if you read what he says there, all his male slaves leave with Stoneman. Because if you're a black slave on the Reynolds Homestead and you see thousands of Yankee soldiers coming through, well, what are you going to do? Well, if you go with them, you know it's free. And a lot of them do. A lot of them go with them. And here's some of the men from Patrick County who end up going with Stoneman's raiders. And Hilton, Reynolds, Taylor, they all end up at Camp Nelson in Kentucky, where they join up. Become the 119th United States Colored Troops. And Jacob Reynolds, Patrick County used to have a quarterback named Jacob Reynolds, and I remember going into class one day, and he was in the class, and he looks up and sees his name. It's one of these guys. But Camp Nelson's probably the newest national park now over in Kentucky, and that's where a lot of these men end up going and serve for a year or two, and then come home. And I don't know how well that went over, because I'm pretty sure some of them probably get pensions from the U.S. Army after the war. And somebody was asking about Reynolds rap. Here we go. This is, of course, RJ's brother, Abram, who grew up here on this property. He's going to go off and fight the war. And he wrote a little diary journal about his experiences. And this is one of the most moving things I ever read from Patrick County Soldier. If you read that, I have this image of him, the scene Gone with the Wind, where they see Wilkes coming down the driveway, and at first they don't realize it's him, and then they run. Melanie runs out to him. I kind of imagine that same scene here. Hardin Reynolds was not probably a really warm and fuzzy guy, and he is so glad to see his son, who could have died in this war. He did lose, I think, use of his arm from the war. And of course, his family, his Reynolds medals, goes off to make Reynolds rap and all that kind of thing. But this is one of the most moving things. Parents should never give up on a wayward child. And so we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks, why he was considered himself a wayward child. So what does the war bring? Well, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. In this county, we were still segregated until I think 1966, 65, 66. It was a separate school for African Americans. When I went into the first grade, I believe I was in the very first integrated class in Patrick County. took from 1865, almost 100 years before we integrated schools in this county. And of course, we didn't know we were in the first integrated class because we were in first grade. But we were, it took that long. And of course, we know what happens here. RJ is going to go down to Winston and start a little business. Another one of the Reynolds is Powell. He's, all right, Darryl, I'm going to try my pointer. You ready? This dude right here, I believe was Powell Reynolds, and he ends up being the president of West Virginia University. I believe that's right. Oops. Edward Martin there on the top left. You remember Wanda's estate jewelry over in Stewart? This was Wanda's, I think, her great-grandfather. And she had a picture of him hanging up in the jewelry store. And if you ever went in there and asked her about it, she would say, yeah, that's my great-grandma. My great-grandma married him. She was much younger and married an old man. And people would ask her, well, why did she marry this old man? And Wanda would say, well, he got a pension. The guy on the bottom left there is Andrew Stedman, who came to Stewart, and he started what we would call the Enterprise today. He was the newspaper man in this county. He was a Civil War veteran. And David Lee Ross, who is this dude right here, his house is still standing over in Evansville, and he, of course, was in the 51st Virginia. And if you know Pat Ross at the Bassett Historical Center, that's her husband's family. He was one of them. This is my favorite story. J.D. Barnard was a soldier in the 50th Virginia. He survived the war. He wrote lots of letters, and they're in my book, The Fruit St. Patrick. And the thing I love about him is this is his daughter, Lois Harris. Some of y'all might know Lois. Lois was a teacher here in Patrick County. My father said when he came to Patrick County in 1959 to teach, she was teaching, I think at Blue Ridge, where he was teaching. And I showed him his picture, and he said, well, she's dressed up like a flapper. And I said, yeah. But I said, that's her father. And Dad, her father? I said, yeah, her father fought in the Civil War. He had 2 marriages. He had 2 families, and Lois is in the second family. And my father, you remember, he was irresistible. My father said, well, you know, she was a good-looking woman then. But that's Lois. And of course, J. Hughes, he had a little business you might have heard of up on the mountain, the Mayberry Trading Post. And I'll argue with you till the sun comes up tomorrow morning that it is where Andy Griffith got the name. And I'll tell you why I say that. If you go to Andy Griffith's papers at Chapel Hill, I don't know why anybody would go to Chapel Hill. Andy Griffith's papers are all there, and in his papers, there's a book about the Mayberry Trading Post, and he has it highlighted where they talk about how he came in there as a little boy with his grandparents, and he doesn't say, heck no, he's got it highlighted. So I think Andy is sending me the message that yes, Mayberry does come from Mayberry. If you haven't been to the Mayberry Trading Post lately, it's got new ownership, and they put some money in it, and it looks pretty good. It leans a little, but if you are 100 years old, you lean too. We have reunions for the Patrick County soldiers. Here's one of the more famous pictures of them. 1900. Oops. And here's the 1903. And right there is Rufus Woolwine. Rufus ends up being the sheriff of Patrick County. He teaches Sunday school at the Methodist Church. And apparently he likes bowler hats, from judging from this picture. But this is all the men from Patrick County. And this is Stewart. And I don't think any of those buildings now are there, but that was the reunion in 1903. And here's Rufus, and there he is. A little close-up of him. Thus ends a journey of 4 years. And he lived to tell about it. And supposedly his journal, they were going to throw it out. And somebody realized that after papers and stuff, and somebody saved it. One of his grandchildren or somebody saved it. And now it's in the Virginia Historical Society, and it's been published, and you can read it.
So the house behind the old library is called the Woolline House.
Yeah, I think that's probably where he lived. I think that's probably where he lived when he, after the war, when he lived in Stewart. And of course, his family's, you know, there've been several very important little lines, you know, I think Thomas and some of them. But I think that he's buried up in the Stewart family cemetery with this fellow. This is William Dennis Vye. Right here is William Dennis Vye. And he and Rufus went through the whole war together. And in 1913, they had the reunion at Gettysburg. And they chose one Confederate and one Union soldier to come and be on the podium with then President Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson, this is what he said that day about the war. Woodrow Wilson had grown up in Augusta, Georgia. His father had been a Presbyterian minister. My mother grew up in Augusta, Georgia. So my grandmother would take me by the Woodrow Wilson house when I was a little boy. We'd ride the bus. I got to pull the chain. That was a big deal, pull the chain, stop the bus. I thought I had some power, you know. But she would take me by Woodrow Wilson's house and would tell me about it. I don't know how she knew this, but she did. He was Thomas Woodrow Wilson. Well, I was Thomas. She's telling her oldest grandson all about the president. And when he had been a little boy at the end of the war, he had seen Jefferson Davis being brought through Augusta, Georgia in the back of a wagon in chains. So Woodrow Wilson knew what it was like to be on the losing side of a war. And so I think that makes what he says right there even more amazing. But William Dennis Vye got to be the man on the podium with the president. And that flag, he's holding a Confederate flag. It's in the Historic Museum in Stewart. They've still got it. And you can go over and maybe John Reynolds pull it out and they say, look at it sometime. But he was the only Confederate chosen to be on the podium with the president. And he ends up being Dennis, Patrick County, Virginia. Talk a little bit about flags. You know, there's lots of controversies about this. If you want to read about this, the best book I've ever read is this one by my friend John Koski. John used to be at the Museum of the Confederacy, and now he retired from the museum that's at Tredegar. And John has written a very good book. Of course, you know, the Confederate flag is a very controversial thing. Here's the Stars and Bars, which was the Confederate national flag for the first 2 years. This is not the Stars and Bars. This is the Stainless Banner, which was the flag for 2 years, pretty much to the end of the war. The reason they changed it is because it was white like that. If the wind wasn't blowing, you would think it's a surrender flag. So they put a red bar out on the end of it, I think right at the end of the war. I don't know if this really got into service much, but that's the story I've always heard. And these are two fellows at Appomattox, buried side by side. Next week, we're going to talk about these three fellas. This is James Jewel Brown and Jeb Stewart on the left, and his brothers, John Dabney Stewart on the top, and William Alexander Stewart on the bottom. And all three of these men were in the war, and we'll talk about them next week. I don't see how you can talk about Patrick County War without talking about Jeb for a while. So we'll do that next week. And we'll talk about his brothers. Maybe, like you said, you learn things, teaching stuff. But all three of them were in the war. All three of them born at Jim Stewart's birthplace in Ararat and grew up there. John ends up being a doctor. William becomes one of the richest men in Virginia. He started Stewart Land and Cattle Company over there in Russell County. His son's going to become governor of Virginia after the war, or during World War I, excuse me. So I thank you for your attention. If anybody's got any questions, Darryl can answer. Let me tell you about my week now. I'm here today. I'm leaving here. I'm going to Richmond. I'm talking about Jeb Stewart tomorrow night in Richmond. I'm coming back Wednesday. I'm doing Mayberry Days for 2 days in Mayberry. Saturday, we're doing 2 programs in Ararat. And Sunday, I'm talking about Andy Griffith at the Mountain Museum. Monday, I'm coming back over here to talk to y'all again. Tuesday, don't call me. Anyway, thank you. Does anybody have any questions? I'll be happy to try to.
I have a question.
Yes, Mary.
Well, I noticed neither one of you professors mentioned money, cotton, and tobacco. So, can you talk about cotton and money and tobacco next?
Well, one story I've always heard about the Reynolds Homestead is that, you weren't supposed to necessarily grow tobacco. You were supposed to grow foodstuffs to help the war effort. So I've always heard that Hardin Reynolds did this thing where he would put corn, like the first 4 or 5 rows around, and then grow tobacco out in the middle of the field. I don't know if that's true or not, but that sounds like something Hardin Reynolds might have done. But Patrick County, Mary, I don't know. I think they were so gung-ho about survival, aren't growing cotton. I can't imagine we were growing cotton around here. Tobacco, and they can't put the kibosh on the tobacco.
My point I'm trying to get is, was the North jealous of the South and the cotton and the money?
Well, I don't know if I'd say jealous. I know the North made a lot of money off the cotton.
The North did?
Oh, yeah. Because, most of the cotton, I think, is going to Britain. A lot of it's going to Britain.
But it was shipped through the
It was
North?
shipped through the North.
Shipped
and I
in
think what
North?
happens was the British maybe saw the war coming. I've seen some research about this. The British saw the war coming, and what they did is they ordered it and built up a big supply. So when the war hit, they had plenty of cotton, and they didn't need it. And that's one of the reasons they never recognized the Confederacy. It was one of the things they could do, because they had enough to get through. Yes, ma'am.
Will either of you be talking more in depth about the lives of Jefferson Davis and Mr. Stevens?
Darrell, you want to talk any more about Jefferson Davis or Alexander Stevens? I'm really not, because, I'm focused mainly on Patrick County during the war. But they both wrote autobiographical books. Wrote big things too. And both have been covered. Jack Davis wrote a great book about Jefferson Davis, William C. Davis.
Jack.
William C. Davis wrote a great biography about Jefferson. I don't know any biographies about Stevens, really. I don't know anything much about him, other than he wrote, I think, one of the most boring books I've ever read about the war. And Jeff Davis went too far behind him when it came to that. Not near as enticing as Darrell Holland's 24th Virginia Cavalry. Well, thank y'all very much. Everybody have a safe trip home, and I hope we see you next week.
You want to take one with you?
They started